Welcome, everyone. I just want to welcome you guys to the show. I know it's a Saturday morning, but we're dealing with different time zones here, so this is the best time to have our guest in. I really feel what he has to say is super, super important. So I really wanted to get that out there, make sure that this interview happened today. Today we have with us Max Haiven, and he's really going to be speaking to us on the radical imagination. And I'll just let him actually do the rest of the talking, to be honest.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Why don't you tell us about yourself and basically who you are and what brought you to write about this?
Sure. Well, my employment right now is as an assistant professor in the Division of Art History and Critical Studies at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. And essentially I teach politics and economics and sociology to artists and art students in the city of Halifax in Canada. But my job doing that and what led me to get a PhD and write a bunch of books is really a long history of social activism and a set of questions that have sort of driven me that come out of social movement struggles, from the anti-war movement, from the alter globalization movement, from anti-racist education, and a whole variety of other sorts of struggles that I've been involved in through my short but exciting life. So I'm the author of a couple of 3 books, actually. One of them is called Crisis of Imagination, Crises of Power. And it's a set of essays about the effect that capitalism has on the imagination. The second book, which I co-authored with my colleague and friend, Alex Khasnabish, is called The Radical Imagination. And it's about social movements and how social movements struggle against the forms of capitalism and racism and patriarchy that sort of haunt the world today. And the third book, which is more academic than the other 2, is called Cultures of Financialization. And it's about finance capital and the global movement of money, and specifically about how that affects our imaginations, how debt and credit and finance shape the way that we imagine the world.
And I think all 3 of those books all 3 of those books are like right in my wheelhouse, so to speak, as far as like what my interests are and doing this show. I'm definitely going to have you back on for the third book, especially. But I think for this conversation, the first 2 are just really, really big. It's a really, really big topic. The purpose of me bringing you on was to basically have us be able to explain to people who are involved in activism, kind of like why philosophy is something important and something we should have as a basically something in our toolkit, so to speak, to help arm ourselves. Can you speak to why the radical imagination, first what it is and why it's important?
Sure. Well, the radical imagination, it gets defined in a number of different ways by different sorts of people. And maybe I'll start by kind of talking about the way that I think most people would typically imagine it. And that is that some people out there have a radical imagination. It's something that sort of exists in their head, and it allows them to think differently about the world. And often that term radical has a lot of negative connotations. We hear a lot about the radicalization of certain populations as if it's a bad thing. We think about the radical imagination slightly differently than that. When we're talking about radical, we're thinking about the original Latin meaning of the word radical, which is comes from the word for the root. And to understand things from a radical perspective, or to have a radical imagination, means to think about social problems and think about the things that are affecting your life and that are affecting society, not as just incidental or just happening here and now, but actually rooted in some sort of larger, deeper structure. So it means thinking about, for instance, the economic problems we're facing today as not simply the result of, this person or that person making a bad decision, but actually a deeply structural and systemic issue with the system of capitalism itself. And it would mean thinking about the forms of police violence that are being enacted today against Black people in the United States, for instance, or Indigenous people in my country of Canada, as not just the result of, bad apples in the police force, but actually a deeply entrenched system of racial injustice that goes back centuries and needs to be addressed through really radical change. And again, radical here doesn't necessarily speak to the particular tactic someone's using. It speaks actually to a desire to transform society from the grassroots up and to really change the structures and systems of society. And then the second term in there is the imagination. And we usually think about the imagination just as like this thing that kind of like a television set in our brain that just is, playing through things. And we all know we have an imagination, but we wanted to think about the imagination less as an individual possession and more as a collective process. And the way this works is that, we don't just imagine, our imaginations don't just exist from the time we're born as this kind of natural and unchanging thing. What we can imagine is possible, who we imagine is valuable, what we imagine is valuable. These are shaped by our social circumstances, they're shaped by our experiences, and they are shaped by how we share ideas, how we share stories, how we share sort of notions of who and what is valuable with the people around us. So to put it all together, me and my colleague Alex Khasnabish, who we work together in this Radical Imagination project, we want to think about the radical imagination as something that social movements do together. And it's a really important part of the way that they function and the way that they operate. It's what keeps people together and keeps them with their eyes fixed on a horizon that they can sort of walk together towards. And without the radical imagination, you end up only ever responding and reacting to the actions of the powerful. The radical imagination is what allows us to say, actually, we are inherently valuable, our lives are valuable, and the agenda we set and the strategy we set is valuable. And it allows us to picture a different world and move towards it together.
Yeah, I think that's there's a lot of stuff in there. Let me try to pick on some things that I want to make a comment on or ask a question about. At first, the first thing when you were talking about the imagination, I was saying, we're speaking about an individual thing, but can you tell us what you mean by it being a collective, like the imagination being a collective of people, or like maybe how people can share a collective imagination?
Yeah, sure. I'll speak about it in general terms, and then I'll maybe speak a little bit about it in terms of social movements. This idea of the collective imagination is one that we pick up from the Greek and French philosopher Cornelius Castoriadis, who was active from the 1950s right until the 1990s. And he actually thinks that almost all of social reality is made up of the imagination. He talks about the imagination as a force like magma, like lava from a volcano that is like a liquid, which then solidifies into a shape, and then at the next eruption, it turns back into a liquid. And if you think about an institution like marriage, for instance, we know from the anthropological record that human civilizations have practiced many, many different forms of marriage over the centuries. Some marriage involved many, many people. Some marriages just involved two. Some marriages are heterosexual. Some marriages are homosexual or sexual in a multitude of different ways. Some marriages are non-sexual. And what this tells us is that the idea of marriage, as important as it is to many of our lives and to our society, is actually a kind of solidification of the imagination. The value we associate with marriage and what we understand marriage to be is this sort of temporary solidification of our collective imagination as a society around a specific form or around a specific mode or shape. So this gives us a sense, and we can extend this to other institutions as well. I mean, the police, for instance, are a social institution that is only really about 150 years old. Didn't really exist in the modern form of, people wearing blue who have the license to shoot you or arrest you until, the 19th century. And so the idea that certain people in our society would be allowed to be armed, that they would be allowed to arrest people, that they would have certain rights and powers that are over top of everyone else, that's, of course, very material. It's something that exists in the real world, of course, these people exist. But on the other hand, the value and the power we attribute to these humans because they get given a badge is an act of the collective imagination. and often with very dangerous effects. So
Yeah,
social movements in some ways, oh yeah, sorry.
I was going to say, I think that's important because we want everybody to remember, even though we're having a conversation about philosophy in general, it does actually have a real effect on everyday lives. It's actually pertinent to everyday issues that we're out here battling. But keep going. I just wanted to make that comment in there.
Well, I think exactly. And I think this is what social movements recognize in some fundamental sense, whether they use this terminology or not. I mean, I think that the thing that most social movements grapple with all the time, the thing I hear again and again, whether I'm interviewing activists or whether I'm active in social movements myself, is this idea that we need to transform people's minds. We need to raise consciousness, or we need to transform people's perception of the world, because most people don't even recognize that the things that are the problems that we're trying to deal with are in fact problems. They don't know, for instance, about the control of the mass media by a few corporations. They maybe don't realize about the depth of the economic injustices or the racial injustices or the gender injustices. So we're always trying to transform people's imaginations and let them see, or help one another realize that the world is, that there are these forces in the world that we need to address, and that the world can actually be different. And I think the radical imagination is the ability to say, actually, if all social institutions, if society at large is made up of this kind of solidification of the imagination, of the collective imagination, then it doesn't need to be this way. Nothing needs to be this way. The economy doesn't need to work this way. The police don't need to work this way. Marriage doesn't need to work this way. All of those institutions can be transformed if enough of us get together, if we make a demand, and if we set into motion certain types of collective power that could actually transform society. And that's an act of the radical imagination. And that's something that social movements are always trying to do. And if we look at any social movement throughout history, at least a part of their strategy and a part of their actions have been about transforming people's perceptions and working together to try and build a collective sense of what exists in the world now and what is possible as well.
So here is something I hear a lot from people. Here's something I hear a lot from people. They actually say stuff like, well, all this person is doing is showing a problem, or they're just talking about a problem, but they're never really giving us a solution, and so it's not helpful to the cause. And I want you to kind of respond to that criticism sometimes people get.
I think those two things don't need to be connected. I think it's an easy out for people to say this person's just commenting on a problem and not giving us a solution, because it actually takes a lot of work to really understand what a problem is. And that's a lot of work that some author or some thinker or some activist needs to do just to develop a sharp analysis of the depth of the problem. That's a work of the radical imagination too, because it's about understanding the roots of a social problem. So, we don't necessarily always need to provide a solution, but a really accurate and analytical and critical understanding of a problem can and ideally should lead to some suggestions about how to change it. So if we understand, for instance, that the economic crisis that we're still in today is rooted in a system of capitalism that's based on corporations making a huge amount of profit off of the labor of the rest of us, that's a radical analysis and a radical framing of the problem. And then that lets us see that, maybe what we need to do to solve that problem isn't just, let's say, raise taxes on corporations, which I think is a good thing, or just punish this or that corporation like Goldman Sachs or, Bank of America, which I also think is a good thing. But maybe we need to have a deeper discussion about the transformation. But I think I think we can separate the discussions to a certain extent. Yeah, you can talk about what the problem is on the one hand, and you can talk about what the solutions are on the other. Ideally, there should be a bridge. I think when we talk about solutions, though, we should be talking collectively about solutions. I don't think it's safe to let anyone, no matter how brilliant, tell us what the solution to our problems are. We need to get together in social movements and in our communities and work through what those solutions are to the deeper problems together. Because I think we've seen the horrors that can be unleashed when we just follow one, prophetic vision of what the future should be, as if it's, as if it can't be deviated from, or as if it can't be tailored to our own circumstances. So I think there's the work of the radical imagination can be critical and can be analytic. It's about unpacking and understanding the social problems from their roots. And then the work of the radical imagination is also this collective work of getting together and saying, how are we going to get out of this mess? How are we going to change things together?
I think that's probably a fair way to kind of look at it. And I want to take it back where you talked about the imagination as like a magma that solidifies into a form, and then it has another eruption. What is the eruption that you speak of? What would be an event that kind of reshapes that? What are those?
Well, I think it's a crisis of those institutions that I talked about. And here I should mention that when we're talking about an institution, we're talking about in the anthropological sense of the term. So an institution is like a building, like, I'm trying to think of an American example. It could be, like the Federal Reserve Bank is an institution. It has it has people who work for it. It has buildings, etc. But an institution in the anthropological sense can also be the institution of marriage, or the institution of the police, or the institution of prisons. These sort of broad structures. So these structures, these institutions, are these solidifications of the imagination. The prison, for instance, is this solidification of the idea that this is what should happen to people who somehow acted in a criminal way and infringed upon society. Of course, we know that the vast majority of people in prisons right now are not there because they've done any grievous crime, but are in fact there for political reasons or economic reasons. There's we can look at books like The New Jim Crow in the United States, the work of Angela Davis, the work of Ruth Gilmore, and see that prisons don't exist to punish people for wrongdoing. They exist to create and sustain political apparatus. So when we look at that as an institution, as we look at the prison as a solidification of our sociological imagination, our imagination of society, what's good, what's bad, we can see that eventually these institutions reach a crisis. They reach a breaking point. People stop believing in their legitimacy. People stop believing their mythology that surrounds them. And in those moments, you get a kind of social eruption. You get a moment where society no longer believes that its institutions are functioning, that they're fulfilling their role, that they work, and that they serve the values they claim to serve. And in those moments, you get a rare opportunity for social institutions to sort of collapse or to melt and to be reformed. Sometimes those reforms are good, and sometimes those reforms are very bad. And I think in the United States and really around the world, we're in one of those moments of eruption. I mean, nobody in their right mind thinks that the social institutions that we have are working. Nobody can look at what's happening and imagine that the institutions of policing are functioning. No one can look at the statistics and think that the institutions of prisons are working. And certainly no one can imagine that the capitalist economy, with all of its many crises, is functioning. It's certainly not functioning for the 99%, so to speak. So we have a moment where there's a break in the way that we imagine social institutions, the way we imagine society, and a chance for people's imaginations to become somewhat more free. But the problem is, when those breaks happen, it's not just the forces of the angels that are at work. There's also the dark forces as well, and you have people like, for instance, in the United States, Donald Trump, or I'm in Germany right now, there's a party called Alternative for Deutschland, there's a social movement called Pegida, which are virulently racist, virulently anti-immigrant, who are also jumping in to say, yeah, the social institutions don't work, but the solution is get tough on this population. The solution is more racism. The solution is more inequality. So when there's a crisis of the imagination, when the social institutions are brittle, or when they begin to melt in some sense, it's a dangerous time, a time of great opportunity, but a time of great challenge as well.
I really like the way you framed that, because you said it's not necessarily good or bad. It can go either direction, and really what's going to be the difference maker is who can basically grab the collective consciousness and steer it in their direction, so to speak. And part of why I do this show, I already spoke to you before, is to try to get people to sort of like have a different understanding, or to examine things critically that we don't normally examine. And I think that was very, very important. What you talked about there was basically that, we're in a moment right now where things are starting to get a little bit fluid, and we can kind of try to change that understanding based on the situation that we're in. But let me ask you this. Um, the imagination being as sort of like an amorphous shape and then kind of solidifying into something that shapes us for a while, how does that kind of continue on from the way Marx viewed the imagination?
Yeah. Well, Marx never really spoke very much about the imagination, and there's a very specific reason. Marx was a 19th century philosopher, and he was a 19th century philosopher who emerged out of this split in German philosophy. And not to go too deeply into it, one side of this split descended into what Marx would have termed romanticism. These are certain followers of Immanuel Kant, certain followers of Hegel, who believed that the imagination was really supreme in the world, and that all you needed to do was sort of free your own individual imagination, and you could free yourself from society's ills. And maybe the present day equivalent of this are like maybe people who believe that if you just listen to the right music, or you do the right drugs, or you read the right books, you're somehow going to get free of the forms of oppression and forms of exploitation that affect you. And that really it's up to the individual to radicalize their imagination and escape. Marx was dead set against this approach. And instead, Marx went the other direction out of this 19th century German debate in German philosophy towards materialism. And that's the idea that, in fact, the imagination emerges from the material relations of society. They emerge from who has the money, who has the wealth, and who has the power. Marx, in his famous text, the 18th Brumaire of Napoleon Bonaparte, sort of famously summed it up that the ruling ideas of society are the ideas of the ruling class. And you can understand that really cleanly in the 19th century, when the only people really who get to publish books, or who get to write music, or who get to publish art, these would be like ruling class people, and they'd be ruling class Europeans, white Europeans, and men mostly. So these people really got to dominate the realm of ideas in society. And Marx said, look, these people can be as radical as they want to be. They can talk, they can have, make up incredible, fantastical ideas and forms of art and culture. But in the end, they're only emerging from one group in society, and that's the group that has power, which is essentially rich, white European men. Instead, what Marx implied in talking about the imagination is, if we want a real radical imagination, if we want to see an imagination that emerges from something that could really transform society, we need to look to the imagination of those people who are experiencing oppression and exploitation. For Karl Marx, that was the working class. And Marx understood the working class as very narrowly, really. He was interested in the industrial working class, the workers in the factories. He was mostly interested in what he understood to be the vanguard working class, which were mostly white, mostly male workers in England and Germany and France. But I think we can look to inheritors of Marx's legacy to find a different story, and one whose work has been really influential on me and other people who've talked and written about the radical imagination is Robin D.G. Kelley, who's a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. Robin Kelley has a great book called Freedom Dreams about the Black radical imagination in America over the 20th century. And there he points to the way that Black radical thought, from the Black Panthers to Paul Robeson to Thelonious Monk to some of today's hip hop artists to a whole range of actors throughout the 20th century, has been a dialogue of people who are, suffering some of the worst forms of exploitation and oppression in society. And out of that exploitation and oppression, and out of the dialogue between, on the one hand, philosophy, and on the other hand, art and culture, you get these ideas that are capable of transforming the world. And indeed, Kelly's argument is that this form of radical imagination that emerged in the Black experience, both in the United States and in the broader global frame, has really reshaped the imagination of all sorts of populations, in North America and around the world as well. So I think in an example like that, you can see almost a better articulation of the imagination than Marx himself could have provided, because he was very allergic to the term. He hated the idea of the imagination. There's only one time when it appears, which I think is really significant, and maybe I'll just close with this. He says something very interesting in one of his texts. I think it's the first volume of Capital, which is, and I can't quote it verbatim, but he says, what separates the worst architect in the world from the best beehive in the world is that the architect, unlike the bee, the architect constructs the structure they're going to build in their imagination first. The bees, for Marx, do it by instinct. The architect does it first through the imagination, and then the imagination builds a building. I have my doubts about Marx's understanding of how bees work, and I think some of the interesting research that's been done on bees and hive and herd behaviors recently might make us rethink that. But I think it's the sharpest articulation Marx ever had about what he thought the imagination is, and I think it's our ability to project ourselves into the future, our ability to make plans, our ability to strategize, and our ability to change the world together. But for Marx, it's significant that he talks about an architect and not, for instance, a musician or not a visual artist, right? Marx is always interested in how we transform the physical world together, under what conditions and under what situations.
Okay, the reason why I even asked was because it just seemed to me, where we're talking about structures and forms, I figured, him being in that time period, that he probably did have something to say about it. At that time, let's talk about I think we've kind of gotten to kind of what it gives us and how it empowers us in a certain respect for change. Let's talk about what works against it to kind of crush it or to keep it dormant, because I'm sure that the people that work against it and don't want that change can understand how the radical imagination can empower people instead of have to work against it. Can we talk about that?
Sure. I think I'd point to three things. The first I point to is the mass media. I think since the end of the Second World War, arguably since the turn of the 20th century or even the 19th century, we've had a huge mass media machine, which really, in many ways, shapes our imaginations. The Hollywood industry of culture, the music industry, the news media, all of these industries are controlled very tightly by a handful of corporations. And those corporations are not completely against allowing any radical ideas in. There's some radical ideas that emerge from Hollywood. Sometimes radical ideas make it into popular songs. Occasionally, a radical theorist will make it onto the news media. But generally, they're interested in reproducing the status quo. They're interested in giving people the lowest common denominator. They're interested in sensationalism because first of all, because they're driven by commercial interests who just want to make money. And second of all, because they're often driven by very conservative interests who want the existing system to continue because it works really well for them. So that's the first blockage to the radical imagination I think I'd mentioned. The second one is history. I think that we don't know our history. We don't know the history of struggles. We're taught history as if it's the work of great men, usually great white men who went around the world and did wonderful things for people. But what we never learn in school, and what most people never even learn in university, is that for every incredible inventor, for every incredible military general or leader, there were millions of people struggling for this or that cause, for this or that movement. And that, in fact, there have been many moments in history where humanity could have taken other paths, that because they were subjugated or destroyed by the powerful, never got to bloom. You know, we remember figures like Martin Luther or Martin Luther King, either the monk from the 16th century or the 20th century social movement leader. We think about these people as individuals who had these incredible effects on history, but in fact, they were just the tip of an iceberg of social movements, of huge upsurges. I mean, in the time of Martin Luther in the 16th century, for instance, and maybe I'm just thinking about this because I'm in Germany right now, most of Germany was in open revolt by peasants. Peasants were taking over whole cities and declaring them communes where they would share all property equally, as they imagined Jesus had instructed them in the Bible. This history is completely forgotten. Martin Luther was a conservative force at the time. He was a conservative who's now been taken to be this great radicalizer of history. Likewise, Martin Luther King, great orator, great leader, but the real organizing was happening on the community level, and the dreams of the community organizers were much larger and much broader even than King's own dream. So our view of history is limited. We remember history only as, this man did this thing, this man did this thing. We don't remember the women. We don't remember the enslaved people. We don't remember the workers. We don't remember all of the other people who contributed to that moment. And instead, we just get this triumphant narrative that would insist that all of history has simply led up to this present moment, as if the world that we live in now is the best world that could possibly have happened, and everything in the past was simply one step towards it.
What I would like, I want to break you right there and ask a question. I often speak about us not knowing the past, and then when the people who lived it and experienced it are no longer with us, how that shared experience kind of gets lost, and that means that past is open for reinterpretation. And even like they insert narratives and things that may not have even been there into that past to kind of change our interpretation of it and really affect where we are today.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can look at a lot of the criticisms that have come from recent film representations of social movements in the past, whether, a good example is the film that was recently made about Stonewall, the great riot and uprising of queer folks in New York. And that film was very charismatic, it was very entertaining, but it completely erased the centrality of trans people and the centrality of people of color in that struggle. So you get this narrative that's now going to be taken as what really happened by millions of people who are going to see that film, that rewrites history in some way, and rewrites history towards kind of a very normal sort of idea of what needs to change in society. It becomes just a narrative of acceptance, or a narrative that doesn't really do justice to the complexities of our struggles today.
Now, I didn't want to derail you. You were going to talk about the third, but I had to say that because I would lose it, because each time you speak, it's like there's so much gold there.
Oh, thanks. The third thing I was going to mention is economics. And, I'll just point to debt as one thing. I mean, I think that the biggest limit on our imaginations today is the fact that our imaginations are actually really hard at work, but not hard at work on things that we could do with them if we wanted to generate art or we wanted to generate social change. Instead, our imaginations are completely preoccupied with just surviving. I mean, I think there's an incredible amount of imagination in just how people without money or people who are hugely in debt manage to feed themselves and their families each day. It's almost impossible. I mean, people get really creative about how they're navigating a world of economic pain and torture, essentially. And I think one great example here is debt. So there's just a stat that was released a couple of days ago that the global debt load today is twice the economic productivity of the entire planet. So it would essentially take Earth 2 years of doing nothing but paying itself back in order to pay back all the debt people owe. And when you have a statistic like that, you have to wonder what's going on. I mean, that seems completely impossible. From an economics perspective and a financial perspective, it's largely possible. But on the other hand, there is a great work of the imagination going on that would allow us as a human species to organize our planetary resources on the basis of debt in this way. And let's remember, debt doesn't exist. Debt is a social institution. It doesn't exist in the physical world. It exists in the collective imagination. So we actually, as humans, and also as citizens of whatever country we're a citizen of, we are in fact committing our imaginations in some sense to this collective project of keeping debt alive. And I think this is what's preoccupying us. I mean, I think about my students, and student debt in Canada is by no means as terrible as it is in the United States, but it's bad still. People tend to graduate with $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in debt. This is what's consuming their imagination. And, you know, it's how am I going to pay back my loans? How am I going to get a job? How am I going to, rather than what could I create? How could I contribute? How can I transform? So I think that just economics, and the economics especially of debt, are something that are really constraining and reshaping the imagination in incredibly negative ways.
I'm actually very shocked. It's such a compelling story. Like when you think about debt, and I think moving out the debt. But when you said about people basically kind of navigating through a world that's meant to make them suffer or to inflict pain upon them, they're trying to survive through that. Someone made a comment to me. They said, you know, think about how much cognitive time this person spends on just thinking about survival that you just don't have to do. And they used a perfect example. When you go to the grocery store and you have a full grocery basket, if you walk up to someone who's barely making it or is, you know, barely making it, basically, you can ask them about any arbitrary item in that grocery store and they'll know down to the cent how much it costs, including the tax. But if you ask me anything that I buy in the grocery store, I can never remember what it costs.
Right.
It doesn't matter.
Well, it brings up a third group of theorists or philosophers that I've drawn on quite a bit, who are Nira Yuval Davis and Marcel Stotzler. And they wrote a very interesting article about what they call the situated imagination a number of years ago, which I've drawn on quite a bit. And in that article, they talk about the fact that, not everyone's imagination is the same. I mean, your imagination is shaped by your life experience. And we can think about the imagination in this sense is who and what do you think is valuable and what do you think is possible? For lots of people who have experienced, you know, nothing except economic pain and suffering for their whole life, their sense of what is possible, real, or what's right is shaped by that experience. And meanwhile, for those of us who've enjoyed a great deal of privilege and wealth, our imaginations are shaped by that experience too. Their other point is that our imagination is shaped by our bodies, whether our bodies are gendered or how our bodies are gendered, how our bodies are racialized, how our bodies experience movement in the world, depending on if we have what sort of disabilities we have. All of these things are going to affect what we imagine is valuable, what we imagine is important, what we imagine is possible for ourselves as individuals and then collectively for society. And for them, they're interested not so much in everyone getting together and having the same imagination of what's possible. You know, like, well, we need this sort of revolution, or we need this sort of social change, or we need this sort of policy. They really are insistent that we need to create spaces where our imaginations can have dialogue, without the idea that all of our imaginations are going to get on the same page. They're going to be synchronized. Rather, we just need to create sort of spaces and then find possibilities for solidarity and possibilities for social transformation. And I think that's happening all the time in social movements, you know, good social movements at least. They're saying, okay, this is an alliance of a lot of different people with a lot of different concerns around racial justice, around gender justice, around economic justice. How are we going to bring these people together and really start to strategize about how we're going to work together towards some sort of bigger transformation?
Now, here's what you said that I want to key in for a second. You said how people are their imagination of what is possible. Talk about like how our belief in what is possible kind of translates into like what we try to build or create, or even how we, you know, feel like this institutions could be shaped or maybe not changed.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I think that we do a lot of work every day to tell ourselves that lots of things are impossible. I'll just give you one example. All debt could be erased tomorrow. It could literally happen through, a few strokes on keypads. I mean, all of our debt, all of the debt that any country owes, all of the debt that today is being used to destroy a country like Haiti, or extort all of the resources from a country like Namibia, or from a country like Kenya, or from all of the debt that's now being used to torture Greece or to torture Portugal. All of this debt, and then all of the debt of all of the students who went into debt to get their education, who should have never been forced to go into debt in the first place, all of that could be erased tomorrow. The only person it would really hurt would be major financial institutions and maybe some rich countries. But it probably wouldn't even hurt them that much. They'd probably survive it. But just saying that is such a radical leap of imagination for many people that I think it indicates just how limited our sense of what is possible is. But I always want to insist that, in fact, thinking it's impossible is an act of the imagination. Because why is it impossible? Why is it impossible to have full universal health care for every single person in the United States? It exists in many countries. Why is it impossible to have an even distribution of wealth, for instance, which has long time been a demand of many different social movements? Why is it impossible to think about disarming or even disbanding the police? Other countries have disarmed their police, and several communities work without police. These are radical ideas, but they're only radical in the sense that we think that they're so completely impossible that we close our imaginations off from their possibility. Even if you don't agree with these policy ideas, that we would have universal health care, that we would forgive all debt, that we would abolish the police, that we would have some sort of more equal system of economics. Maybe that isn't your cup of tea. I think there's a value to keeping your imagination open to the idea that, of course, it's possible. We just need enough people to believe it's possible, and enough people to believe that it's necessary, so that they're willing to come together and fight for it.
I think, oh, it looks like we lost him for a second there. But to actually get on the tail end of what he just said, I think basically, if there's nothing physically limiting you, like basically, of course, you know, you can't go outside and fly to the moon or something like that. Maybe that's not possible per se, but you know, things that are impossible for reasons that are not of the physical world, I think that should all be open to discussion. Like, you know, he just mentioned eliminating all debts. There's nothing saying you can't do that. You know, debt is fictitious. It's completely, it's a complete figment of institutions, right? It doesn't really exist per se. It's just an existence that we make into existence. So there's nothing saying that we can't just wipe it all out and basically do something different with it. The same can be said for other things. I don't know if we're gonna be able to get him back, or if he just lost internet connection there. Okay. But let me take a second to look at kind of like what the viewers are talking about, and I'll basically try to interact with them for a bit while we try to get him back. Oh man, so it looks like basically the chat is just going off on something completely different. Okay, so basically, what I would like to do at this point is take a second to basically kind of reiterate kind of what we were talking about. I want to remind everybody that we're on the Benjamin Dixon Show, and this is the Takedown with Nick, a special edition. We're interviewing Max Haiven. We just lost him.
Hello?
But coming back soon.
Hello? Are you able to see me here?
Yes.
I'll have to on 2 seconds.
Sorry about that.
No, my apologies.
There might be a slight delay, Nick.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, if you could use headphones, your sound's coming back to your speakers.
1 moment here. Just a sec. Is this situation a bit better here?
I mean,
it sounds like the echo left.
Good. Okay, great.
Nope.
I wonder how it wasn't like that before.
I had to switch devices because my computer had some sort of weird error.
Oh. Okay, well, continue what you were speaking about. We'll kind of work that out.
Sure.
I don't remember what he was talking.
Oh, okay. Well, the professor was speaking about the third ring, which was economics, and then we spoke about possibilities and how what people believe is possible kind of served as either a barrier or an impetus to create change, to basically create change in the physical realm where we are in a material sense.
Well, I think that essentially the certain alternatives are completely impossible or not worth thinking about is very dangerous, because the radical imagination for me means not settling for the conventional understanding of what is possible. It means really digging back into questions about the nature of value itself. Who is valuable? What is valuable? Why are we living the way we're living? Why do certain power structures in society exist? And when you begin asking those questions on, I think, a really deep and fundamental level, what you get is a set of really radical proposals for a different sort of society. And I think those sorts of proposals or those sorts of ideas really need to be thought through and explored and entertained. Because otherwise, if we're simply accepting reality and the sort of social reality as it's given to us, a lot of people fall through the cracks. There's no reason, for instance, anyone should have to be homeless in just society that's ever existed. And somehow, simply because we don't think carefully and we question that idea that will allow there to be homeless people, many people are suffering incredibly, simply because of complete failure of the imagination.
That is something that I tussle with myself. When I speak about politics, speak to people about politics. I'll often say hey, it doesn't have to be this way. And they'll always say, well, this is what is. I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean it can't be something different.
Yeah,
there's nothing stopping it. Obviously, I spoke about this while you were out. I spoke to the audience. I said, you can't fly to the moon because human beings can't defy gravity. But there's no reason why we can't reshape and change the structures that we create.
Yeah, we did fly to the moon as a human species, and we'll do many other amazing things, and we'll do them not because we said, well, it's impossible to fly, so we'll never go to the moon, but we said, okay, it is impossible to fly, that's a reality, but we know all of these we have all of this scientific information, we have all of this technology. How can we take this fundamental goal of getting to the moon and move towards it? And it took people to be able to say, actually, this is a valuable and worthwhile effort in order to make us move from the realm of the imagination to the realm of the possible. Now, the moon landing is perhaps a bad example because it was essentially funded and driven by sort of a Cold War competition between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it was funded and much of the technology was sort of gobbled up by arms companies. So maybe it's not a great example, but other great struggles in history are, I mean, I would just take, for example, something I learned about very recently, which is the socialist candidacy of Upton Sinclair, the famous American novelist who ran for governor of California during the Great Depression on a really radical agenda, and actually had many resonances with the Bernie Sanders campaign that just concluded in the United States. Sinclair, a great novelist of the American working class, documented migrant worker experience in the United States, the experience of farmers during the Dust Bowl. He ran on a platform that included sort of radical ideas as nationalizing Hollywood. So Hollywood would become a dream factory by the people and for the people, which today just seems completely wild. But when you start to think about it, has a certain logic or a certain sense to it. I don't know if I agree, but it's certainly interesting. He ran on a platform of suggesting that would be open to homeless and unemployed people found America, around the world, and they all come and be a new kind of republic. There would be very, very steep taxes of wealth, and no one would go hungry.
Hey,
and
Max.
This all indicates that he. Sorry?
I don't know if we're having a connection issue, but your audio is getting distorted there.
Oh. More
can you
quiet.
Can you give me a mic check?
Check.
Okay. I just want to kind of break it up there and say we're still having the echo problem, and your audio is getting distorted. So what I want to do is it possible that kind of like when I'm speaking, you can hit the mute button on your side?
Yes, absolutely.
And that way we can get it in, and then I'll basically be silent, and when you're talking, then basically we'll kind of figure out a way to kind of get it so that the audience doesn't get the distortion. But let me ask you to give us some thoughts on where you see the current election is, like the current politics of the United States. Can you kind of give us a broad brush of what you see going on there and kind of relate it to kind of what we're talking about?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I'm not an American, so I follow it with from a slight distance. I mean, I think my perspective is that it's an atrocious situation for both parties, and hopefully it's the end of the two-party system, because I think that most people are faced with no realistic alternative. I mean, I think that everyone else in the world has no problem calling Donald Trump a fascist. He is a fascist, but one who's too, frankly, stupid to understand what the word means. So, the idea that he would run a campaign based on racist and sexist demagoguery is totally sickening. But of course, it's not that far from what other Republican candidates have been doing since the Reagan era, since Goldwater. I mean, this hot button politics, blaming immigrants, blaming people of color, blaming people who depend on various forms of state assistance, goes back a long way. And the media machine and the news machine and the political machine has been waiting for the perfect storm that is Trump for a long time. So on that level, I don't think there's much more that needs to be said. I mean, I just hope that he doesn't ever gain any more power than he already has. But in fact, he's already done a huge amount of damage. I think the much more damning thing, to be frank, is the Clinton campaign, which I think is offering us nothing more than a slightly worse version of business as usual as it existed under the Obama regime, which means more drone warfare, which means that debt will continue to pile up, that the working class, both white and non-white, their condition will get worse over the next 8 years or 4 years of her presidency, and that there'll be no meaningful action on climate change, and that in fact the world will become a much more dangerous place for everyone except the proverbial 1%. And given those two options, I don't know what I would do if I was an American citizen at this moment. My hope is that some of the energy and ideas that started to emerge from the Sanders campaign can manifest themselves as a meaningful social movement. And I know there are a number of people who are really working very hard on this. A social movement that might be able to not just offer palatable political alternatives, but offer really radical grassroots processes. And I think we can look around the world to what those would look like. For instance, I was just in Spain last week.
Oh, Podemos.
Podemos is very impressive on one level, but the social movements that are going on underneath them, or that have sort of pushed them up to power, are even more exciting in some ways. I'll just give you one example of La PA, which translates to basically people affected by mortgages. Like the United States, there was a massive foreclosure crisis in Spain after the 2008 financial crisis. La PA works as a kind of combination of a 12-step program and a direct action social movement. So they meet with people, they have community gatherings of people who've been evicted from their homes or are going to have their homes foreclosed. And the first step is showing them that they're not alone and that together they can do something. And then they discuss together what they can do to save this person's home or to get them a new home. And they show up at banks, they shut down the banks, they have massive, very loud protests, and they take over abandoned buildings and turn them into free or affordable housing for their members. This movement has over 100 chapters in cities and towns across Spain. One of the key organizers of that movement last year became the mayor of Barcelona. A number of other people from that movement are on the city council of Madrid. So there's a real grassroots transformation going on. And I think this is the important point, Mayor. Maybe it ties to the radical imagination and this idea that the radical imagination isn't something that we say or that we think. It's something that we do and that we do together. It's not just that these charismatic leaders showed up and said, vote for me. Podemos is a very interesting political formation, an interesting political party. But their strength and their ability to have some success in the polls really comes from a lot of people working at the grassroots and saying with their bodies and with the way they spend their time and the way they collaborate together that, to borrow that phrase from the World Social Forum, another world is possible. When the La PA, the people affected by mortgages, get together, they are helping people transform their imaginations by insisting that, in fact, the bank doesn't have the right to take your home, that no bank should be able to turn a family out on the street, that's a monstrosity. That's an act of the radical imagination that isn't just about someone telling you, here's a wonderful, beautiful idea or a theory, but someone saying, look, we can do it together. And when we do it together, everything could be different. And so I hope that the Sanders campaign evolves into something like that has a real grassroots ability to transform people's lives and thereby transform what they think is possible.
I want to first start off by thanking you for coming and spending your time. I definitely would like to have you on again because I think this conversation, just about everything you were saying was golden.
Oh,
I want to add one more question, and then I want you to let the viewers know where they can find you on Twitter and also plug your books, to talk about your books once more and any other engagements that you may have that you would like our viewers to be aware of. I think that they really enjoy what you have to say. It is really, really important. But I had another person on, Les Leopold, and he spoke about there was still lacking a militancy and a determination here in the United States as far as the movements are concerned. Like right now, there's still resistance, but there's not that same moving a step forward and becoming, a force that really asserts itself, such as in Europe. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that it's true. I mean, Upton Sinclair, whom I mentioned just a second ago, had a wonderful phrase that the reason why there's never been a revolution in America is that rather than seeing themselves as an oppressed mass, the working class in the United States see themselves as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. implying that, if everyone believes that all you need to do is work, in spite of all the evidence to the contrary, is work hard as an individual and compete against everyone else and make money and succeed, and you believe it's your fault for failing, then I think we're locked in a system where everything can only be understood in terms of reform, and everything can only be understood in terms of reforms that make it easier for the individual to make money and for the individual to quote-unquote succeed. And what we need is a militancy, but it's a militancy based on an idea that our fates are bound together, and that if we're going to survive the incredible challenges that now face us as a human species, and also as a place like the United States or wherever, it's going to take solutions that are about taking care of each other much better, and taking care of each other in ways that overcome racism and sexism and homophobia and the other things that are used to divide us. So I think in some ways, yeah, militancy is necessary, and I don't know what that militancy looks like. The only last thing I would say about it is the proverbial other side is militant and is radicalized. The people, we know that there are white supremacists who see the candidacy of Donald Trump as the greatest thing that's happened to their movement in generations, and who are taking, maximizing on the potential and the chaos that the economic crisis has unleashed in order to recruit people to very, very dark causes. And I think we need a militancy that can offer a different imagination of what's possible. And without it, both here in Europe and in the United States and everywhere else, we're headed to very dark places. So I think the time is definitely right for the radical imagination and for the militancy that comes from saying that we are fundamentally valuable and we have a right to assert and defend our value against the predations of the economy and the predations of capitalism.
I think I tell my viewers this sometimes, but we're not here for reform. We're here for fundamental transformation, and those are different things. Mm-hmm, and I preach that a lot, and I say it a lot, and I just said it today. But remind everybody where they can find you if you have any engagements coming up that they might want to tune into, or also plug your books. And
Sure.
We'll go ahead and close out.
Well, people can find everything at my website, which is maxhaiven.com. It's maxhaiven.com. And you can also find me via my name on Twitter and on Facebook as well.
All right. Thank you, Max, for being with us. And we want to wish everybody a happy weekend. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Going off, Nick?
Yeah. Thank you, Max, for coming in. This was a stimulating conversation.